The deep litter method is something I use on my farm here at Hillside Homesteading for many reasons. Number one reason being that I don't want to be outside mucking out a dirty, wet chicken coop in the middle of winter when it's minus 30 degrees Celsius. It's just not something I'm going to be doing pretty often because it's so cold and everything is frozen that it would be too hard to do that anyway. So using the deep litter method is beneficial for me for that main reason. It's also beneficial for the chickens because it gives them some beneficial microbes, and I also get some beautiful compost at the end when I muck out the coop. So here are the main reasons why I use the deep litter method and why I think you should too. The deep litter method is one sustainable method of managing chicken litter in the chicken coop that many small farmers like myself use, especially in the winter time. In the deep litter method, you're basically forming a compost pile directly on the floor of your chicken coop, and the chickens help you form that compost. Like a compost pile, you begin with a layer of pine shavings or other organic materials. This is considered part of the browns category. Then the high nitrogen chicken poop is added by the chickens, which is part of the greens category. So simply add enough pine shavings on the floor of the chicken coop for it to compost nicely and it won't get too wet. The chickens will do the aeration for you with their scratching behavior. Scattering a little bit of feed on the floor will encourage them to scratch up a little more if that's what you need. The litter has beneficial microbes in it, so think of it kind of as a probiotic for your hens. So once or twice a year or less, depending on how wet it is and how much it's composting, you'll clean out the coop. The resulting material can mostly be used directly as compost in your garden. If you notice a few spots that are fresher than others and not quite as broken down, you might want to throw it in the compost bin for a few months or at least a few weeks before you use it. The benefits of the deep litter method are, it doesn't take a lot of time to manage, so that is huge in the winter time. You end up with compost, pure organic natural compost that you created right on your farm, and you can use it directly in your garden. The birds get to scratch through the microbes and beneficial culture that's living in the litter, which is in turn good for them, pretty much like a probiotic. It doesn't smell, which is huge, especially in the winter time when you're not feeling like cleaning out the coop so much. And in the dead of summer when it just seems like everything smells and there's flies around, the deep litter method really is beneficial in the fact that it really doesn't smell. It's safe and the birds will stay healthy if you employ this method. So what do you use on the floor for a deep litter method? For the deep litter method, it's best to use something like pine shavings. It's pretty inexpensive and it's available at most of your local feed stores in bales. You can also use straw on the ground as well. The straw, you might have to top it up a little more frequently because sometimes, depending on the weather, it might be a little more susceptible to holding in moisture, and you don't want it to hold too much moisture. So you might want to add a bit more of the straw and turn it all the time and make sure it's staying composted and that it doesn't get too wet, and also ensure that your coop has very good ventilation. Ventilation is so underrated when it comes to raising chickens that I'm probably going to do a video just on that alone. But let's get back to the deep litter method. You can also use hay in there as well, but just make sure that you don't use cedar shavings. Cedar is toxic to chickens, so just stay clear of cedar. The deep litter method also works really well for those of you who have a dirt floor in the chicken coop. The dirt really adds to the microbes, and it also contains a lot of bugs and things like that that the chickens can eat, which also helps the chickens keep their protein level up, and it's really beneficial for them. But those of us who have a floor in the coop, you can still do this method. You're just going to have to top up the bedding a little more often, turn it a little more, and then you might have to clean it out at least once every 6 months or so, depending on how many birds you have in your coop. So a few tips to help you with your deep litter method. Don't remove all of the bedding. Whenever you clean out your coop, even if it's once or twice a year, you're going to maintain that level of composting by keeping some of the previous material that you had in there. So Don't get rid of all of it. Use some of that as your base, and that will help encourage it to break down and to start composting a lot faster. So make sure you keep some in there. Don't clean out your coop too often. If it starts to smell or something's wrong with it, it means that you either need more ventilation or you need to add bedding more frequently, or it needs to be turned more. So do any of those instead of cleaning it out, because if you do, you're gonna have to start all over again. The only time I would recommend starting over again is if you have a buildup of too much ammonia, and you'll be able to smell it when you go in the coop. It's very strong, it's very pungent, and you'll be able to tell that that's ammonia. And you want to make sure you clean it all out, and I would just start again. Another tip is to not use diatomaceous earth when you're doing this method. I don't use the DE directly in the coop. I will probably sprinkle the DE on my chickens directly and just leave it out of the coop, because that will inhibit the growth of the beneficial bacteria, because that's what diatomaceous earth does. Start with 4 to 6 inches of pine shavings, and make sure you're monitoring the moisture level so that it's not too dry, but it's also not wet. If it's wet, then you need to add more bedding and you need to turn it more. But if it's too dry and it's actually not composting, then you're not doing what you want it to do. So you want there to be an adequate amount of moisture, but that should only come from the chicken poop. Alright guys, thank you so much for joining me for this video. I hope you learned something about the deep litter method and how you can employ that in your chicken coop. Thank you for joining me. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel for a lot more content. I'll see you in the next one. Stay peaceful.